As a translator, I work through agencies and I have good relations with them. And they're the same people year after year, although the staff can change, I suppose, but often it's the same people. And they know me. And when they retire, I might, um, I suppose I would be seen as retiring also. So I might get left on the shelf a little bit if the replacements don't know about my work. But I suppose there will be some documentation, and the fact that I'm quite reliable might be mentioned. But my customers in the early days were companies, not my customers, I don't know whether to call them the end users of my translations. They're frequently private companies. I think that's the lion's share. Although there may also be a municipal authority of some description. And if it's a municipal authority, the work will go to an agency that has an in with that municipal authority. That's how it works. Italy, well, probably all over the world, I don't know. They're good contracts, and if a company has good connections, if an agency has good connections, then they might get some very big projects on their desks. So I do have one of my customers, I would think, in that category, and I'm very pleased to work with them because I get paid a little bit more, and the work remains the same sort of thing. I don't have to take, any special precautions other than to do it to the best of my ability, which I always do. Not to say that it's always massively successful, but generally it seems to be okay. But in the early days, the companies, the end users of my translations were companies that made things. And when I started translating, I didn't know how things were made. And most of the industrial processes were completely unclear to me. Also because I was finding Italian vocabulary that I didn't hear, of course, in ordinary conversation, because this is special language. And so it was hard to recognize things. And in the early days, we didn't have the internet. So one of my very first translations concerned a supposed foot and mouth outbreak where I lived, in the area where I lived. And it was, I think, probably working for the veterinary service, the state veterinary service. So this was an inn, presumably, but this is the early days of translation. And I was quite at sea with the terminology, and fortunately, I went to see them. I went into their headquarters, which was clearly a government office of some description. And in the waiting room on the table, there were several copies of a magazine called Pig International and another one about swine something or other. And I just seized them, and I managed to go home with several copies. And they were exactly what I needed to get some understanding of the things I was writing about. But then the internet came in, so that has been so helpful, of course. And, ultimately it's tied us down quite a bit as translators, because anything that you write, your customer, your end user, could well search for it on the internet, and you'd better hadn't make any mistakes when you use it. So you're tied to some extent to a level of conformity, which can be tiring, shall we say, can be, what's the word for it? Well, it's constraining, especially in the area of creative language. You can't afford to say something too clever and to think that you've made it up, because you haven't. And then you just have to decide how many instances in the world you will allow before you'll use that phrase. As you've got to filter out all the people who are as thick as me, or have misused it, or they're foreign language speakers. Make sure that you find it in a reliable setting. That's the work. But my end users were making stuff mainly. And I was very interested in the whole process. And I went to visit many different private companies after that first translation on foot and mouth disease. And I would chat to the end, and they'd give me an engineer or somebody, and we'd have a chat. And quite often they'd take me around the plant and show me the machinery working. And it was an absolute eye-opener to me, and I began to become more and more interested in the subject matter of the various translations. And I've always found it a very interesting job to do. I feel very blessed to be able to do it. I've got no qualification whatsoever, but it's just fallen in my lap, really, through, you could say through circumstance, but I would say through the hand of God, because I have to, when I look back on my life, it's very clear to me that it's always been in the hand of God that's put me in all these odd situations and conditions. And I can see that from when I was a lad and I painted the thief on the cross for some reason, for example, and other religious themes, while not having any understanding really of the Bible, but I was interested in those ideas somehow. And then a lifetime of not really paying any attention whatsoever and not picking up a Bible. Finding an authorized version of the Bible face down in the mud by a waste container in the road outside my house. Picking it up and taking it into the house and still not reading it. And that was probably 20 years ago. And then ultimately chancing upon a church and beginning to understand something, and ultimately coming completely under the conscious authority of Jesus Christ, who has guided my footsteps forever, leading me into some very perilous situations, well, letting me get into them of my own accord, of course, but allowing me, and hopefully teaching me some very valuable lessons. That's the way I feel about it always. But there I was. But the reason I wanted to speak about this was that I've begun to realize that my end user companies now no longer really spend so much time describing their products and flaunting them and the intricacies of how they're made and how they function. What they do is they list their connections and their connections with various alphabet organizations that issue awards in the realm of sustainability and diversity and all these things, and compliance with this, that, and the other. Much of the writing is about this sort of stuff. And then there'll be some sort of side frivolous stuff to prove that the particular company is engaged in the social sphere, and they sponsor some nonsense rubbish that people go to and apparently love. So that's nothing to do with their main line of business. And that's what the text has turned into. It's far less interesting, very, very dull. because every single organization, every single award, every single partnership, every single certification has to be carefully searched on Google to make sure that I get it exactly right. It has to be exactly as it is written. That's become the important thing. And the reason that they do it, I suppose, is because the only people who would, well, nobody reads the things that I write anyway in that sphere. I can't imagine that anybody would be so masochistic, you could say. I suppose the people in the company will read it, the people who've written it will read the translation, but I don't think anybody else would really, and nobody in their right mind, except perhaps just a buyer or somebody, just making sure that the company ticks the right boxes. Because, with the big contracts now, the big international contracts, if those boxes aren't ticked, you won't get the contract. And those are the people that have got the money. They've got their hands on the cash. That's why this stuff continues to gain traction, even though every man and his dog knows that it's nonsense. But that's where the money lies, you see. And so translation now is, most translations are, to me, less interesting. All I'm doing is listing university connections, compliance here, compliance there, approval from this, approval from the other, the award here. And it's all about ticking boxes. So there you go. God bless today.